For 70 years, we've lived in a world run by American rules. It kept us safe, it kept us rich. But this week in Davos, Mark Carney admitted the terrifying truth. That world as we knew it is over. The old order is not coming back.
He calls it the rupture, and right now countries are scrambling to survive. Trump is seizing territory on maps, Europe is fighting for economic survival, Greenland is fighting for sovereignty, and Canada? We are preparing for a totally new reality. This isn't just a political speech, this is a survival guide for the end of the American order.
So let's start with the evidence. The photo that Trump posted. He shares an AI photo of him at the desk, a group of European leaders on the other side, and on the easel, a map. Canada, Greenland, Cuba, Venezuela, covered in American flags.
A year ago, people laughed, but nobody is laughing now because look at the bottom of that map and look at Venezuela.
That isn't a drawing anymore. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is sitting in a cell in Brooklyn. U.S. forces struck the country, extracted the leader, and Trump explicitly said the U.S. will run Venezuela until further notice.
He called it a judicious transition. He said U.S. oil companies are going to start making money from the country. He even kept proceeds from the first sale of Venezuelan oil in an offshore bank account based in Qatar.
So, when you look at that map, you realize this isn't a meme. It's a to-do list to help Trump get rich.
And the threat is expanding. 10% tariffs on European allies, rising to 25% unless he's allowed to acquire Greenland. So from up here in Canada, we're watching and talking about three things. First, why Trump is talking like the entire hemisphere is his backyard. Second, what Carney actually said at Davos that got him a standing ovation. And third, why Canada suddenly looks like the adult in a room full of egos.
You've got a Canadian Prime Minister telling the world's most powerful people, the old US-led order is done. Middle powers are tired of being pushed around. And if you're not at the table, you're lunch.
But first, to understand Carney's rupture, you have to understand the explosion that just happened in Europe.
When Trump talked of acquiring Greenland, Europe didn't just send an angry letter. They sent troops. They deployed military reinforcements to the Arctic to signal that Danish sovereignty wasn't up for negotiation.
And Trump didn't take the hint. He clapped back. He saw those troops as a personal insult, so he reached for his favorite weapon, the tariff stick.
Europe is now cornered, and French President Emmanuel Macron responded by bringing up the bazooka option, which is a massive coordinated economic strike against the US dollar to force Trump to back down. He also warned that the European Union's response would be unflinching and proportional.
Then he does something that, for any other leader, would be a full-blown scandal all on its own. He starts leaking private messages from allies, screenshots, names, the whole thing.
If you're an ally, you're thinking, can I ever send this man a candid message again?
Of course not. But wait, he's not even finished. Next, he posts a text from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
It's mind-blowing, you know? He's burning the privacy of the alliance's top officials.
And while all that's happening, he's churning out AI images like a teenager with a new graphics app. One shows him, J.D. Vance, and Marco Rubio planting a giant American flag in the snow with a sign that says, Greenland, U.S. territory, established 2026.
Every one of those posts sends the exact same message. This isn't a negotiation. In his head, the map is already colored in. Tariffs are just the stick he uses until the rest of the world accepts it.
And after all that, there's Canada. Carney walks into Davos and instead of replying with his own outburst, he basically says, we're done pretending the system works the way the brochure says it works.
He opens with Václav Havel's story about the shopkeeper. And if you don't know it, this is how it goes. The government drops off a little sign with a party slogan. The shopkeeper knows it's nonsense. His neighbors know it's nonsense. But he puts it in the window so that he doesn't get in trouble. And Havel's point was simple. The system doesn't survive just because of brute force. It survives because normal people keep going through the same motions. They act as if the sign means something.
And Carney takes that idea and points it straight at us. Companies, countries, middle powers like Canada. He says we've been doing the same thing with the rules-based international order. We've been putting the sign in the window, saying the words, all while knowing full well the strongest countries step outside the rules whenever it suits them.
Yeah, for decades, we went along because, honestly, it worked well enough. The US kept sea lanes open. The financial system mostly held together. There were courts and institutions you could appeal to, even if they were a bit selective who they punished.
So Canada played along. We joined the clubs, we gave the speeches, and told ourselves we were protected by the self-appointed world police next door.
Well, Carney's line in Davos is that this deal is over. Not evolving, not challenged, over. He calls it a rupture, not a transition. Great powers are now using the very things that were supposed to bind us together, trade, finance, supply chains, as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, payment systems as pressure points, chips, minerals, energy routes, all treated as choke points instead of shared tools.
And in that world, keeping the sign in the window and pretending this is still the old post-war order doesn't just make you naive, it makes you vulnerable.
And here's where he does something very undiplomatic for Davos. He doesn't just blame the usual villains. He tells the middle powers to look in the mirror.
He basically says when we criticize economic bullying from rivals but fall silent when it comes from allies, we are part of the problem. We are still living within a lie. We're helping to keep the shop window dressed.
And you could feel the room react, because everyone knows who he's talking about without him actually saying the name. The United States threatens tariffs on Europe until it hands over Greenland, threatens Canada over steel and autos, tears up trade deals, then uses access to its market like a weapon.
Middle powers grumble, issue mild statements, then go right back to acting like this is just all a phase and everything will reset if they wait long enough.
Well, Carney's answer is that reset is not coming. The old order is not walking back through that door. You either accept and start building something new, or you keep pretending and watch your leverage shrink.
And then he drops the line that got the reaction. Sovereignty now is the ability to withstand pressure.
Not how nice your speech sounds, not how often you say rules-based order at a podium. Can you feed yourself, fuel yourself, and defend yourself without being blackmailed? Well, if not, your independence is mostly decorative.
So what does this new withstand pressure Canada look like in his mind?
Well, first, at home, he talks about cutting taxes on incomes and investment, clearing barriers inside Canada so we actually function as one market instead of a patchwork, and fast-tracking $1 trillion in projects, energy, AI, critical minerals, trade corridors. And on security, he says Canada is doubling defense spending by the end of the decade. Submarines, aircraft, over-the-horizon radar, boots on the ice in the Arctic.
And this is where Greenland comes in. While Trump is drawing flags all over the Arctic like it's a coloring book, Carney is saying Canada stands firmly with Greenland and Denmark. Article 5 still applies. If you attack them, you're taking on all of us.
And then he also goes out of his way to name Russia as the real threat in the Arctic, not as a theory, but as a military reality. Missiles, submarines, the whole package. He calls their assault on Ukraine horrific and unjustified, and links that same behavior to what could happen up north if allies don't get serious.
And then there's the way he's redrawing our trade map.
In 6 months, he says Canada has signed 12 trade and security deals on 4 different continents. We joined the EU's defense procurement program, SAFE, and we're helping Europe rearm while the US lectures them about spending.
He just cut a deal with China where we lowered tariffs on a capped number of electric vehicles in exchange for China easing up on Canadian canola and seafood. That signals that Canada is not going to let Washington dictate every inch of our relationship with Beijing.
And at the same time, he's talking about buyers' clubs for critical minerals, linking the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the European Union, and pulling Qatar into long-term investment in Canadian infrastructure.
This is what he calls value-based realism. Less sermons, more contracts. Keep the core principles, sovereignty, human rights, territorial integrity, but accept that not every partner will be a saint. Work issue by issue and coalition by coalition.
And again, That's where the middle power line comes in. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. If you deal one-on-one with a hegemon, you beg. If you show up with 8 or 10 countries behind you, you negotiate.
Now let's bring it back to Macron for a second, because this week is the perfect split screen. On one screen, you've got Macron publicly feuding with Trump over tariffs and invites to the Board of Peace. Trump wants to build his shiny committee, hands out chairs, and then threatens to punish anyone who doesn't play along. Macron pulls back, Trump hits French exports, and everyone loses.
Then on the other screen, Carney says Canada will join that same Board of Peace, but he frames it differently. He says, we're not writing a giant check to buy status. We're there to make sure aid actually reaches Gaza, that the two-state process isn't just a photo op.
So on the personal level, it looks like Macron acting like a frustrated teenager, and Trump is like the toddler with access to tariffs. To me, Canada is the one who walks in, reads the fine print, and asks, okay, so how do we use this to actually help people without selling our soul?
We get it. France has real interests to protect. But from the Canadian balcony seat up here, you can see the difference in strategy. Macron is responding to Trump, and Carney is trying to root around him.
And on Greenland, that contrast is even sharper. Trump waves his map and threatens tariffs until he gets the island he wants. The European Commission president warns of a united, proportional response. Carney says, yep, fine. Let's make Greenland safer, let's invest, let's reinforce NATO's north. But the flag on the map is staying Danish.
And here's why this matters if you're sitting in Winnipeg, Whitney, Windsor, or Whitehorse thinking, okay, but how does this change my life?
Well, because Canada is uniquely exposed to the U.S. pressure. We share the longest border in the world. Most of our trade still runs south, and when Trump starts turning economic screws on us, we feel it immediately in auto plants, lumber mills, and steel towns.
At Davos, when the moderator asked whether that makes us almost uniquely vulnerable, well, Carney's answer was basically yes. But look at the record. Since Trump's tariff wave started, Canada has actually created more jobs than the US in absolute numbers. Our economy is growing faster than most of the G7.
And his larger point is that we can give ourselves more than any one foreign country can take away. One Canadian market, huge domestic projects, a web of partners, not just one. That's the definition of sovereignty he's selling, the ability to withstand pressure.
So when Trump shows you that doctored hemisphere with Canada under an American flag, Carney's answer is, draw whatever picture you want, dude. We're reinforcing the Arctic with NATO, we're diversifying trade, we're cutting our own deals with Europe, Asia, and the Middle East.
It's Canada quietly stepping into a role that a lot of people assume belonged forever to Washington. The steady partner who doesn't burn every relationship for a quick headline or to leak private conversations like some tabloid reality star.
Now, are there risks? Of course. Getting closer to China brings its own set of headaches. Betting on coalitions instead of one big umbrella means more moving parts. And if you misjudge any of it, you end up stuck between two angry giants.
But here's the honest part that I appreciate Carney is telling people. He's not telling them to sit tight and hope the old order pops back into place. He's saying openly, hey, it's broken, it's not coming back, and waiting for it is a waste of time.
And that's a very un-Ottawa thing to say. Usually the line goes, steady as she goes. And he's basically saying, steady as she goes is how you end up on Trump's map as someone else's property.
So where does that leave Canada in this Davos week of drama?
Well, on one side, you have Trump, who thinks posting a picture of the hemisphere blanketed in American flags is a clever negotiating tactic. On the other, you have Macron, who keeps getting dragged into emotionally charged standoffs over wine, meetings, and who sits on which panel.
And then you've got Canada walking in with a different posture, not screaming, not pretending that everything is fine, and definitely not assuming that the US will eventually come back and fix it. We're just quietly saying, we're going to build something with whoever is serious enough to show up.
Middle powers combining instead of begging. That's the idea here. It's not glamorous. It doesn't give you a viral photo of flags pasted over a continent. But over time, it's how you shift real power.
And it's why that Davos crowd, that's not famous at all for their emotional outbursts, got on their feet when Carney finished. They weren't cheering for a perfect plan. They were cheering for someone finally saying out loud what everyone's been muttering over cocktails this whole year. The old deal is gone.
Now, the question now isn't will we get it back? It's who's going to shape what replaces it. And for once, Canada isn't just politely nodding from the back row.
No, we're right in the middle, leading the other middle powers, acting like an adult between a toddler with tariffs and a teenager with a wine cellar.
So, in the comments, we want to hear from you. Tell us this. If sovereignty is the ability to withstand pressure, what should Canada build first? More economic independence? More Arctic defense? Stronger middle power clubs?
And if you're watching for Europe, what do you want from Canada in this Greenland mess? Do you trust us to be the steady partner? Or do you think we're overestimating ourselves? So we'll keep being your sanity check north of the madness, and thanks for watching, everybody. If you want, you can join the A-Team to help keep this channel independent and check out our Substack for more in-depth reviews.
We'll see you tomorrow. Ciao for now.